Imagine you're standing at the edge of an ancient forest where the trees are older than memory. The mist rolls in thick, curling around the gnarled roots of towering oak trees, and for a moment, the world feels different. As if you've stepped into a place where time doesn't move the way it should. This isn't just any forest. It's a place of power, a place where stories are born. And at the center of it all is a figure who is much more than a man. His name is Merlin. You've heard of him even if you don't know the details. He's the wise old wizard, the master of magic, the one who shaped the fate of King Arthur and Camelot. But the truth is, Merlin is more than just a kindly mentor in a pointy hat. His story is bigger, older, stranger. He's a prophet and a trickster, a kingmaker and an outcast. Some say he was born from something not entirely human. Others say he knew too much, saw too far, and carried the weight of a future he couldn't change. He's been called a druid, a madman, a sorcerer. He's been a shadow in the woods and the power behind thrones. He's shaped history and then disappeared into legend. But how much of the legend is true? Where did Merlin come from? What did he know? And how did the most powerful magician in Britain meet a fate that no one, perhaps not even he, could escape? This is the story of Merlin, the legendary wizard of Arthurian mythology. Merlin's origins are as mysterious as the magic he wields. His story isn't neatly written down in a single book, nor does he have a fixed beginning like King Arthur or Lancelot. Instead, his legend has shifted and evolved over time, making it difficult to pinpoint where he truly comes from. Some stories paint him as a wild prophet, others as the son of a demon, and some even suggest he was an ancient druid who outlived his time. His legend is a tangled mix of history, myth, and medieval imagination, with no clear starting point. The earliest version of Merlin isn't found in the grand courts of Camelot, but wandering the wilderness, lost in madness. This version of him appears in Welsh poetry, where he is called Myrddin Wild, or Merlin the Wild. According to legend, Merlin was once a bard and advisor to a 6th century warlord named Gwyndoleu, a ruler of what is now southern Scotland. Merlin supposedly fought alongside him in a battle against rival Britons. However, when Gwyndoleu was killed, Merlin lost his mind. Stricken with grief and horror at the bloodshed, he fled into the Caledonian forest, living among the animals, speaking only in riddles and cryptic prophecies. Some say he survived on nothing but berries and the whispering voices of the trees. The people who encountered him claimed that he had been gifted, or cursed, with second sight, doomed to wander alone, predicting the fate of Britain but unable to change it. This version of Merlin is not a grand court magician nor a powerful sorcerer, but something closer to a druid, a man deeply connected to nature, untouched by the rules of civilization. His prophecies, spoken in fits of madness, were said to foretell great battles, the rise and fall of kings, and the ultimate fate of Britain. But despite his visions, he was seen as little more than a wild hermit, feared and misunderstood by those who crossed his path. For centuries, Merlin remained a local legend, a Welsh figure known only in poetry and oral storytelling. That changed in the 12th century when a man named Geoffrey of Monmouth reimagined him entirely. Geoffrey, a cleric and historian, wrote a book in 1136 called Historia Regum Britannia, the history of the kings of Britain. This was a grand retelling of British history, part myth, part invention, and entirely captivating. In it, Geoffrey introduced a new version of Merlin, now called Merlin, and transformed him into something far greater than a mad prophet. He became a powerful sorcerer, a master of prophecy and a kingmaker whose influence stretched across Britain's history. Geoffrey merged multiple legends to create his version of Merlin. He took inspiration from Myrddin Wilt, but also added elements from Roman and Christian traditions. In Geoffrey's story, Merlin is no longer a mere man. He is the son of a mortal woman and a supernatural being, an incubus or demon. This half-human, half-otherworldly origin made Merlin unique among Arthurian figures. Unlike Arthur, whose destiny was shaped by knights and kings, Merlin was guided by forces beyond the mortal world. He was both a man and something more, existing between realms, neither entirely good nor entirely evil. Geoffrey of Monmouth's reinvention of Merlin laid the foundation for every version of him that followed. No longer just a mad prophet or a wild druid, he was now a figure of immense power, a wizard, a manipulator of kings, and a force woven into Britain's destiny. His influence would only grow from here. Later, writers would expand on Geoffrey's vision, adding their own details, myths, and magic to Merlin's legend. Over time, he became Arthur's mentor and protector, ensuring the boy would one day become king. The mastermind behind the sword and the stone, proving Arthur's divine right to rule. A master of magic wielding spells beyond human comprehension. A tragic figure doomed by his own fate despite his power. But before we dive into Merlin's later roles, there's one more question to explore. What did he look like? How did different writers and artists depict the most powerful magician in Britain? Merlin is one of the most instantly recognizable figures in Arthurian legend, yet what he actually looks like varies wildly depending on the version of the story. Unlike Arthur, who is almost always depicted as a noble king, or Lancelot, who is always the perfect knight, Merlin is a shapeshifter, both in terms of his actual magic and in how he has been portrayed over time. The earliest depictions of Merlin don't show him as a wise old wizard or a courtly magician, but as a wild, half-mad hermit living in the forests. As we touched on before, this version of Merlin comes from the Welsh legends of Myrddin Wyllt, a wandering prophet who, after witnessing the horrors of war, fled into the woods and lost his mind. He wears tattered clothes or animal skins, having abandoned civilization entirely. His hair and beard are long, unkempt, and wild, making him look more like a druid than a noble scholar. He speaks in riddles and cryptic verses, muttering prophecies that only make sense long after they come true. This feral, untamed version of Merlin represents the old ways of Britain, before kings, knights, and castles. Though he may appear as a madman, he possesses a deep, hidden wisdom, a reminder that truth is often found in the places people least expect it. By the time Geoffrey of Monmouth reimagined Merlin, his appearance had changed significantly. Now, Merlin was no longer just a wild prophet of the woods. He was a trusted advisor to kings, standing at the heart of Britain's destiny. This is the version of Merlin that would inspire later medieval writers, shaping how we imagine wizards even today. He is often depicted as an old man with a long flowing beard, a sign of his wisdom and power. He wears long robes, sometimes adorned with stars and arcane symbols, reinforcing his mystical status. His eyes are piercing, filled with knowledge beyond mortal understanding, and he often carries a wooden staff, either as a walking aid or as a focus for his magic. This version of Merlin is calm, composed, and deliberate. He moves between the world of men and the world of prophecy, never fully belonging to either. This depiction of Merlin, the wise old wizard in the long robes with the flowing beard, became the template for nearly every wizard in fiction that followed. From Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings to Dumbledore in Harry Potter, this image of the aged, powerful magician can be traced back to the medieval reinvention of Merlin. As the Arthurian myth grew and spread, Merlin's image began to shift again, reflecting the interests of the time. During the 14th and 15th centuries, when alchemy, astrology, and hidden sciences became popular, Merlin was reimagined as a scholar and philosopher. Instead of wandering the forests, he now appears in hidden towers or grand libraries, studying secret knowledge. He is associated with alchemy, the practice of transforming materials and seeking eternal wisdom. He is sometimes depicted surrounded by books and scrolls, suggesting he has access to ancient texts long forgotten. And some versions even claim that Merlin built Stonehenge, using his magical knowledge to transport the massive stones from Ireland. This version of Merlin, while still a sorcerer, is also a man of science and intellect. He represents the idea that knowledge itself is a kind of magic, and that those who understand the hidden laws of the universe can control them. This portrayal was likely influenced by real-life scholars and alchemists of the time, who were often rumored to possess mystical powers due to their understanding of astronomy, chemistry, and natural philosophy. Merlin is one of the most complex figures in Arthurian myth, a man who exists in both history and legend, walking the line between civilization and the untamed forces of the unknown. Unlike Arthur, whose character is largely defined by chivalry and kingship, Merlin is a force of nature, sometimes a guide, sometimes a trickster, and sometimes something much harder to define. He does not follow the rules of men, nor does he seek power in the way kings or knights do. Instead, he moves through the world on his own terms, often seeming like a man out of place, belonging neither fully to the present nor the future. Though Merlin is often depicted as Arthur's mentor, his true role in the legend is far more expansive. He is not simply a tutor teaching a young king how to rule. He is the architect of Arthur's destiny, the unseen hand guiding Britain's future. He does not seek power for himself, nor does he rule a kingdom. But without him, Arthur would never have existed, let alone become a legendary king. Merlin's methods are not always noble, and his actions often blur the line between wisdom and manipulation. While Arthur and his knights strive toward ideals of honor and chivalry, Merlin is far more pragmatic. He understands that the world does not always reward goodness, and sometimes deception is the only way to ensure the right outcome. He is known for using trickery and illusion to accomplish his goals. Whether it's disguising people, setting up elaborate tests, or bending events in ways no one else understands, Merlin's schemes often involve manipulating those around him. His actions show that he is willing to make morally questionable choices if he believes they are necessary for the greater good. Unlike Arthur, who is often portrayed as idealistic, Merlin is realistic. He understands the flaws of men, the failures of kings, and the way power corrupts. He does not waste time hoping people will make the right choices. He ensures that they do. But this also makes him a dangerous figure. Those who underestimate Merlin often find themselves outwitted. He is neither good nor evil. His loyalty is to fate, not to individuals. He is on Arthur's side, but that does not mean he will always act in ways Arthur or anyone else understands. While Arthur is destined for a throne, Merlin has no interest in ruling. Unlike the knights of the Round Table, who are bound by their oaths, or the kings who are bound by their crowns, Merlin is free. He does not serve any kingdom, nor does he swear allegiance to any one ruler. He is not a warrior, nor is he a nobleman, yet his influence often outweighs both. Merlin exists outside of power, yet he is the one who shapes it most. Without him, Arthur would never have been born. Arthur would never have become king, and the ideals of Camelot would never have existed. Yet, Merlin never takes a seat at the Round Table. He does not participate in its quests, nor does he fight in its battles. He creates the legend but never becomes a part of it. This makes him both crucial and invisible. He is the architect of Arthur's reign, yet he will never stand beside him as an equal. He belongs to a different world, one that exists beyond the realm of knights and kings. Merlin is not just a prophet or a magician, he is a guardian of something far older than Arthur's kingdom. While Camelot represents the ideals of a new order, Merlin is a relic of the past, a bridge between the old ways and the new. Some versions of his story suggest that Merlin comes from a time before Christianity, representing the last remnants of the ancient Druidic traditions. He sees Camelot as a fleeting moment, a bright flame that will burn out, just as every kingdom before it has. He understands that Arthur's rule is not the beginning of something eternal, but the last stand of something fading. Yet rather than resist it, he ensures that it happens. Merlin's role is not to stop change, but to guide it. Despite his immense power, Merlin is deeply alone. His knowledge of the future separates him from other men. He cannot form real friendships because he already knows how they will end. He does not fall in love because he understands the cost of attachment. He does not build a home because he is never meant to stay in one place. Unlike Arthur, who is surrounded by knights, friends, and allies, Merlin walks a solitary path. He does not belong to the world he helps shape. He exists outside of it, watching, guiding, but never truly belonging. His greatest flaw is that despite all his wisdom, he is still human. He may see the future, but he cannot escape it. He may guide others, but he cannot control what happens to himself. And in the end, despite all his knowledge, all his magic, and all his power, Merlin will fall, not in battle, not by sword, but by the one thing he never saw coming. Hey everyone, just a quick intermission here. I wanted to say thank you for watching this video. It really means a lot to me. Did you know that over 80% of you who are watching right now aren't subscribed to the channel? If you've enjoyed this content so far, it would be incredible if you could hit that subscribe button. It's a small gesture, but it really helps the channel grow and ensures that you won't miss any more of our fascinating stories we explore together. Also, if you're feeling generous, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment, and share with anyone else who may enjoy it. Your support really does make a difference and keeps the content coming. Thanks again, and let's get back to the story. Merlin's role in Arthurian legend is not just that of a wise old advisor who guides a young king. His influence begins long before Arthur is even born. He is the one who sets events in motion, ensuring that Arthur's destiny unfolds exactly as it should. Without Merlin, there would be no King Arthur, no Camelot, and no legendary kingdom of knights and chivalry. But how does he do it, and why? Before Arthur can become king, he must first exist, and that only happens because of Merlin. Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, was the High King of Britain, but his rule was anything but secure. The Saxons were pressing in from the east, rival lords were plotting against him, and worst of all, he was consumed with a dangerous obsession. Uther had fallen desperately in love with Igraine, the wife of Duke Gorlois of Cornwall, but she was already married, and Gorlois, suspecting Uther's intentions, took her to Tintagel Castle, a fortress so well defended that no army could breach it. But Uther was not a man who took no for an answer. Desperate, he turned to Merlin, offering anything in exchange for a way to be with Igraine. Merlin, knowing that the union of Uther and Igraine would lead to the birth of Arthur, agreed, but at a price. Using his magic, Merlin transformed Uther to look exactly like Gorlois, allowing him to enter Tintagel undetected. That night, Uther lay with Igraine, and Arthur was conceived. But Gorlois himself died in battle that very night, fighting Uther's forces outside Tintagel. When Igraine learned of her husband's death and Uther's deception, she had no choice but to marry the king. Merlin's plan had succeeded. Arthur was now set to be born. However, Merlin had no intention of leaving Arthur's fate to chance. He demanded that Uther hand over the child once he was born, insisting that he must be raised in secret, far away from the dangers of court politics. Reluctantly, Uther agreed, and so when Igraine gave birth, Merlin took the infant Arthur and placed him in the care of Sir Ector, a noble but relatively unimportant knight, ensuring that the boy grew up unaware of his royal lineage. This act, removing Arthur from the world of kings and intrigue, was perhaps the most important decision Merlin ever made. It allowed Arthur to grow up humble, honorable, and untouched by corruption. Had he been raised in Uther's court, surrounded by power-hungry nobles, he might never have become the king Merlin envisioned. But this was only the first step. As the years passed, Uther's reign collapsed into chaos. He died without a clear heir, and Britain fell into civil war as rival lords fought over the throne. It was then that Merlin set the next phase of his plan into motion. A mysterious sword appeared embedded in stone, bearing a simple inscription: "Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone is the rightful king of Britain." The greatest noblemen, knights, and warlords all attempted to set the sword free, but none succeeded. Meanwhile, Arthur, still unaware of his true parentage, lived as the adopted son of Sir Ector, growing up alongside his foster brother Kay. The moment that changed everything came not on a battlefield or in a grand ceremony, but through sheer chance. A great tournament had been arranged in London, meant to bring together the greatest warriors in the land. Sir Kay, eager to prove himself, prepared to fight. But at the last moment, he realized he had forgotten his sword. Turning to Arthur, he ordered him to fetch it, but when Arthur arrived at their lodgings, the weapon was nowhere to be found. Panicked, he searched for a replacement, his eyes falling upon a mysterious sword lodged in stone. To Arthur, this was not a legendary test. It was simply a sword he needed to retrieve. Arthur casually pulled the blade from the stone, unaware that this single action had just declared him king of all Britain. Merlin had set up this test for one reason, not to prove Arthur's strength, but to reveal his fate. Arthur had not been raised to crave power. He had no ambition for a throne, and yet destiny had placed it in his hands. Merlin guided him to this moment, ensuring that when the time came, Arthur would take the crown not out of greed, but because it was his destiny. With Arthur crowned as king, Merlin continued to shape his journey, helping him build Camelot, the Round Table, and the ideals of chivalry and justice. Merlin did not act as a mere political advisor. He was Arthur's greatest teacher, imparting knowledge of war, leadership, and the mystical forces at play in the world. He warned Arthur of the dangers of power, taught him the lessons of past kings, and did his best to prepare him for the challenges ahead. But Merlin also knew that Arthur's rule was fragile. He had seen the future, seen the betrayals, the battles, and the final tragedy that would bring it all crashing down. Yet, he did not intervene to stop it. Why? Because he understood something that Arthur never could. That fate can never be changed. Merlin was no ordinary man. His influence on Arthur's rise to power wasn't just due to wisdom or political cunning. He possessed abilities that set him apart from all others. He was a seer, a magician, a master of illusion, and a force that seemed to exist outside the normal bounds of time and space. His powers were both a gift and a burden, allowing him to shape Britain's fate while also trapping him within a future he could not change. Unlike warriors who relied on steel and strength, Merlin's greatest weapons were his mind, his magic, and his ability to manipulate reality itself. But just how powerful was he? And what were the limits of his abilities? As we touched on briefly, Merlin's most defining ability was his gift of prophecy, a power that made him both revered and feared. He did not simply predict vague possibilities or educated guesses about the future. He saw events unfold with terrifying clarity, often long before they happened. But his visions were not always straightforward. They came to him in cryptic riddles, symbols, and glimpses of fate that were often difficult to interpret. This made his prophecies both valuable and dangerous. Kings and warlords sought his guidance, but many feared him as well. After all, knowing the future meant holding power over those who did not. Merlin's magic wasn't just about seeing the future, it was about controlling perception. He was a master of illusion, capable of making people see what he wanted them to see, bending reality to suit his plans. As we mentioned before, one of his most famous feats of illusion was disguising Uther Pendragon so he could enter Tintagel Castle, a deception that led to Arthur's conception. But this was far from his only trick. Merlin could vanish at will, appearing and disappearing as though stepping between worlds. In some tales, he could change his own shape, taking the form of animals, spirits, or even elements of nature itself. This made him nearly untouchable, allowing him to move unseen, escape danger, and influence events without ever being noticed. His abilities also extended to creating entire landscapes of illusion, casting mists over battlefields, making castles appear where none existed, or causing warriors to see visions that would shake their resolve. To his enemies, this made him terrifyingly unpredictable. To his allies, it made him an invaluable weapon. Merlin's connection to the natural world was undeniable. Many believed that his magic was tied not to books or arcane rituals, but to the land itself. He could summon storms, calling down rain and lightning upon those who opposed him. He could speak with animals, gaining knowledge from creatures that others ignored. Some even believed he could bend the earth and rivers to his will, shaping the landscape as he saw fit. His influence over nature made him seem more like a druid than a traditional sorcerer. Unlike the dark magicians of later myths, Merlin's magic was rarely destructive. It was a force of balance, one that worked with nature rather than against it. Merlin's power wasn't just supernatural, it was intellectual. He possessed knowledge that far exceeded that of ordinary men, including secrets of the old gods, the ancient druids, and lost magical arts. He understood the stars, the movements of celestial bodies, and the hidden forces that governed the world. He knew of potions, charms, and enchantments, and in some tales, he was even credited with creating sacred objects of power. This vast knowledge allowed him to be a teacher, a strategist, and a guide, not just for Arthur, but for all who sought wisdom beyond the reach of mortal minds. For all his abilities, Merlin was not omnipotent. His magic had boundaries, and there were forces even he could not overcome. Fate was unbreakable. No matter how powerful he was, Merlin could not prevent certain destinies. He saw Arthur's downfall long before it came, yet he could do nothing to change it. His knowledge of the future was both a gift and a curse. His emotions could be his undoing. Though wise beyond measure, Merlin was still human in his desires and weaknesses. His love for Vivian, the Lady of the Lake, would ultimately lead to his downfall. More on that later. He was bound by the balance of magic. Unlike later sorcerers of fiction who wielded power without consequence, Merlin's abilities came with natural limits. He could guide Arthur, but he could not rule in his place. He could protect the kingdom, but he could not change the fate that was woven into its foundation. His power was not meant to conquer but to guide, and yet despite all his strength, even he could not escape his own fate. For all his wisdom, for all his foresight, Merlin failed to see, or perhaps refused to accept, his own downfall. His power had shaped kings, changed the fate of Britain, and guided Arthur toward greatness. And yet, in the end, it was not war, not a rival sorcerer, nor the weight of prophecy that brought about his undoing. It was love. The great wizard who had shaped the very course of history found himself trapped by his own heart, ensnared by the one person he trusted most, Vivian, the Lady of the Lake. This was not just the end of Merlin, it was the beginning of Camelot's fall. The story of Merlin's love for Vivian varies depending on the source, but the core of it remains the same. Merlin, who had lived a life of wisdom, secrecy, and control, became hopelessly enchanted by a woman who, for all her beauty and grace, had her own ambitions. Vivian was no ordinary woman. She was the Lady of the Lake, a figure of magic and mystery who would later bestow Excalibur upon Arthur. But before that, she was a student of Merlin, learning the secrets of his power, absorbing his knowledge piece by piece. And Merlin, despite his foresight, despite his unmatched wisdom, fell in love with her. Some versions paint their relationship as a tragic romance, a love that was genuine but doomed. Others depict Vivian as a cunning manipulator, someone who seduced Merlin not with passion, but with a hunger for knowledge. In some versions of the tale, Merlin knew full well that she would betray him. He had seen it in his visions, had whispered of it to the wind, and yet he let it happen anyway. Perhaps he believed he could change fate, or perhaps he simply didn't care. Vivian was not satisfied with merely learning from Merlin. She wanted his power for herself. And so, she played the role of devoted student, carefully prying his secrets from him, one by one. Merlin, blinded by love or by some strange acceptance of his destiny, gave her everything. One by one he taught her his most powerful spells, and one by one she absorbed them, waiting for the moment when she would no longer need him. Then she turned his own magic against him. In some stories she seals him inside an invisible prison, a cave, or a hollow tree, where he remains trapped for eternity, unable to escape. Others say she casts him into a deep sleep, one from which he will never awaken. In every version, the result is the same. Merlin, the most powerful sorcerer of his age, is helpless. He disappears from history, his voice silenced, his power locked away. Camelot, left without its greatest protector, will soon crumble. The most haunting question about Merlin's downfall is whether he allowed it. Did he, with all his foresight, truly fail to see his own fate? Or did he see it coming all along and choose not to fight it? Some legends suggest that Merlin welcomed his imprisonment, that he had grown weary of the world, of war, of seeing the future, and being unable to stop what was to come. Perhaps he knew that no matter what he did, Arthur's kingdom would fall, that his own magic could not hold back the tide of fate forever. And so, he allowed himself to be taken, choosing love, or at least choosing an end. If that is true, then Merlin's final act was not one of defeat, but of acceptance. He had set Arthur on his destined path. He had done all he could, and so he let the story continue without him. Merlin's imprisonment marked the beginning of the end for Arthur and Camelot. Without his guidance, Arthur would face betrayals he could not foresee. Without his wisdom, the kingdom's foundations would begin to shake. Without his protection, dark forces would rise. But Merlin was not truly gone. Even in his absence, his influence remained. His teachings lived on in Arthur's ideals, in the formation of the Round Table, in the magic woven into the very heart of Camelot. And some say he still lives. There are tales that speak of Merlin not as dead, but as waiting, trapped in a timeless prison, where he sleeps until Britain needs him once more. In some stories, he will awaken one day. When Arthur returns and when the world is on the brink of disaster, Merlin will rise again. Until then, his legend endures, his magic still lingering in the myths of Britain. And the story of the wizard who shaped kings, saw the future, and loved too deeply remains one of the greatest tales ever told.